In all the bloody history of Tudor England, one execution stands out, not for the fame of its victim, but for its sheer, horrifying incompetence. This is the story of how a 67-year-old noblewoman, a cousin to the king, wasn't just executed, she was butchered on the scaffold. Her crime, her name. She was a Plantagenet, one of the last survivors of a vanquished dynasty. And in the paranoid court of King Henry VIII, that was a death sentence just waiting to be signed. This is the story of Margaret Pole, and her brutal end at the hands of a tired king. So, who was Margaret Pole? To understand her tragedy, you have to understand her place in the world. She wasn't just a noblewoman, she was a princess in all but name, born Margaret Plantagenet. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, and the niece of two English kings, Edward IV and the infamous Richard III. Her Plantagenet blood was as royal as it gets, a direct link to the medieval kings who ruled England for over 300 years. But that same blood that gave her status also painted a target on her back. Her dynasty had been overthrown by Henry Tudor, Henry VIII's father, in the Wars of the Roses. The Tudors were new, their claim to the throne shaky, and any living Plantagenet was a dangerous reminder of a rival claim. Margaret's early life was soaked in tragedy. Her own father was executed for treason against his brother, King Edward IV. Her younger brother, Edward, was imprisoned in the Tower of London as a boy and eventually executed by Henry VII, simply because he existed. Margaret was left to navigate the treacherous new Tudor court alone, in a strategic move to neutralize her royal blood. She was married to Sir Richard Pole, a loyal supporter of the new king. For a while, it worked. When Henry VIII took the throne, Margaret's fortunes skyrocketed. Henry seemed to genuinely like her. He reversed her brother's attainder, made her Countess of Salisbury in her own right, one of only two women in 16th century England to hold a peerage title without a husband, and restored her family's vast lands. She became one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures at court, and was even appointed lady governess to the king's beloved daughter, Princess Mary. She was respected, powerful, and for all intents and purposes, family. From this dazzling height, her fall would be that much more shocking, a brutal testament to just how fast the king's favor could curdle into deadly hatred. The beginning of the end for Margaret, and for the world she knew, came down to one thing: the king's great matter. This was the official term for Henry VIII's obsessive quest to annul his 20-year marriage to his first wife, Katherine of Aragon. Katherine hadn't produced a male heir, and Henry, obsessed with his dynasty, was convinced God had cursed their union. He needed a divorce to marry the captivating Anne Boleyn, a decision that would crack the very foundations of English society. For Margaret, this wasn't just politics, it was deeply personal. Queen Katherine was her longtime dear friend. More than that, Margaret was the governess and confidant to their daughter, Princess Mary. She had helped raise the princess, loved her like her own, and now had to watch as this political firestorm engulfed her. When Henry's great matter led to a full break with the Roman Catholic Church, Margaret faced an impossible choice. Supporting the king meant betraying her faith, her queen, and the princess she adored. But remaining loyal to them meant risking the king's suspicion, and maybe his wrath. Margaret, a devout Catholic, chose the path of quiet loyalty. She stood by Katherine, and her devotion to Princess Mary never wavered. When the king's marriage to Katherine was declared void, Mary was branded illegitimate and stripped of her title. Margaret's position became impossible. She famously refused to hand over Mary's royal jewels to the new Queen Anne Boleyn, and kept calling Mary Princess. In Henry's eyes, such quiet defiance was an act of treason. He fired her, banished her from court, and tore her away from the heartbroken Mary. Margaret retreated to her estates, the symbol of silent, dignified opposition. But the storm wasn't over. It was about to get a voice, a powerful, eloquent, and dangerously defiant voice that would echo across Europe and bring ruin to the entire Pole family. That voice belonged to her son, Reginald Pole. He was a brilliant scholar and clergyman, once so favored by Henry that the king himself had paid for his education. Henry hoped to win his esteemed cousin's support for his new church. He was about to be catastrophically disappointed. From the safety of the continent, Reginald Pole didn't just refuse to support the king, he declared ideological war. In 1536, he wrote a blistering theological attack on Henry VIII called Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defension, in defense of ecclesiastical unity. It wasn't a gentle critique. He called the king a tyrant, a heretic, and a schismatic. He condemned the executions of Thomas More and John Fisher and, most damningly, called on the Catholic rulers of Europe to invade England and depose Henry. When a copy landed in Henry's hands, his fury was limitless. This was a call for foreign invasion, written by his own cousin. It was the ultimate betrayal. The king raged that he would have Reginald's head, but Reginald was safe in Italy, soon to be made a cardinal by the Pope. Henry couldn't touch him. So, in a chilling act of vengeful fury, he decided to do the next best thing: destroy his entire family back in England. Justice in Tudor England didn't work the way we think of it today. Collective punishment was a grim reality. The sins of one family member were often visited upon them all. Reginald's treason became his family's treason. Suddenly, the Poles were seen as a nest of vipers, traitors loyal to Rome. The king's chief minister, the ruthless Thomas Cromwell, was tasked with rooting them out, and he got to work with terrifying efficiency. The blow fell in August 1538. In a series of coordinated arrests, Cromwell's men seized Margaret's eldest son, Lord Montague, and her brother-in-law, Sir Edward Neville. They were accused of conspiring with Cardinal Pole. The evidence was flimsy, based mostly on hearsay, but in Cromwell's England, it was more than enough. The real target, however, was the family's matriarch, the 65-year-old Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole. In November 1538, a delegation led by the Earl of Southampton arrived at Margaret's home to question her and search for any scrap of evidence linking her to her son's plots. Margaret, frail but unbroken, faced them with steely resolve. For hours, they interrogated her, but she gave them nothing. She insisted she was a loyal subject, horrified by her son's actions. She was, as she famously declared, no traitor. Frustrated, the officials ransacked her home. It was then they made their bombshell discovery: a white silk tunic embroidered with the 5 wounds of Christ. This was an explosive symbol. The 5 wounds had been the banner of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive Catholic uprising just 2 years earlier that had nearly toppled Henry's throne. The tunic was presented as irrefutable proof that Margaret was secretly backing a Catholic rebellion. Historians are almost certain this evidence was planted. The idea that this cautious old woman would keep such a blatantly treasonous item lying around is almost laughable. But whether it was real didn't matter. It was what Cromwell needed. Based on this single, dubious piece of evidence, Margaret Pole was arrested. Her son, Lord Montague, and other relatives were quickly tried and executed. But Henry had a slower, crueler fate planned for Margaret. She was never given a trial. Instead, the government used a terrifying legal weapon, the Bill of Attainder. This was an act of Parliament that could declare someone guilty of treason and sentence them to death without a court, a jury, or any presentation of evidence. In 1539, Cromwell dramatically produced the tunic in Parliament, and the Bill of Attainder was passed against Margaret Pole. She was stripped of her titles, her lands, and her identity. She was now legally a traitor, condemned to die. Yet, the execution didn't happen. Instead, she was sent to the Tower of London, where she languished for over 2 years. For a woman in her late 60s used to a life of comfort, the tower was a living hell. She suffered from the cold and damp, her health failing. She was kept alive as a political pawn, her fate hanging on the whims of a vengeful king who likely hoped holding her hostage might silence her son. But Reginald Pole wouldn't be silenced. And as long as he defied the king, his mother's life hung by a thread. In the spring of 1541, that thread finally snapped. The morning of May 27, 1541, was cold and gray. Inside her cell, Margaret Pole, now 67 and frail from 2 years of harsh imprisonment, had no idea it was her last day. There was no warning, no time to make her peace. The constable of the tower simply arrived and told her she was to be executed within the hour. The order came directly from the king, who used a small rebellion in the north as a pretext to finally get rid of the Plantagenet matriarch. She wasn't taken to the public scaffold on Tower Hill. This was to be a private affair, inside the tower walls, away from the eyes of the public. Perhaps the government was ashamed of executing an elderly noblewoman without a trial for a crime she almost certainly didn't commit. As Margaret was escorted to the small, hastily built scaffold, a new horror became clear. The official executioner was out of town. In his place stood a wretched and clumsy youth, a boy conscripted for the job, someone with no experience with the heavy, razor-sharp executioner's axe. The stage was set for a spectacle of unimaginable horror. What happened next was recorded in the horrified reports of European ambassadors. Margaret Pole walked to the block with a courage that stunned the few witnesses. She maintained her innocence to the very end. When told to lay her head on the block, she refused, defiantly proclaiming, "So should traitors do, and I am none." She told the boy that if he wanted her head, he would have to take it as he could. The inexperienced executioner swung the heavy axe. He missed. The first blow landed not on her neck, but deep in her shoulder, tearing a ghastly wound. In agony and shock, Margaret allegedly leaped from the block and tried to stumble away. What followed was pure butchery. The panicked boy chased her around the scaffold, hacking at her back and shoulders as she tried to escape him. It was no longer an execution, it was a savage pursuit. The small crowd watched in stunned silence as the frail old woman was struck again and again. By some accounts, it took as many as 11 clumsy, brutal blows to finally kill her. By the end, the scaffold was a slaughterhouse, its boards slick with the blood of one of England's last Plantagenets. The execution was over, but the story of its brutality would echo for centuries. News of the butchered execution spread, first through London, then across Europe. Even in an age used to brutal violence, the story of Margaret's death was met with revulsion. The ambassador Eustace Chapeyes called it a lamentable and piteous spectacle. It was a PR disaster for Henry VIII, cementing his reputation not as a great Renaissance prince, but as a blood-soaked tyrant. He hadn't silenced his enemies, he had created a martyr. For her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, the news was devastating. He had defied a king from a safe distance, and his mother had paid the price. He wrote that he was now proud to be the son of a martyr. His chance to return would come years later, after Henry's death, when Margaret's beloved charge, Mary, became Queen Mary I. Reginald returned to England as the Archbishop of Canterbury, but his victory was hollow. His family was gone, destroyed by the king he had so fiercely opposed. Politically, Margaret's death was a terrifying warning. No one was safe from Henry's paranoia. Royal blood, old age, high rank, none of it offered protection. If he could order this done to his own elderly cousin, he could do it to anyone. Religiously, she became an icon. For English Catholics, her steadfast faith and horrific death made her a hero. In 1886, Pope Leo XIII officially beatified her, recognizing her as the Blessed Margaret Pole, a martyr for the Catholic Church. Today, a plaque in the Tower of London marks the site of the scaffold. It lists the famous names executed there: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, and among them, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Her ghost is said to haunt the tower, a spectral reminder of the day Tudor justice descended into sheer, barbaric cruelty. The story of Margaret Pole is one of the most tragic and brutal in Tudor history. She was a woman who survived the fall of her own royal house, earned the trust of one Tudor king, and rose to immense power under another. She was a Plantagenet princess by blood, a countess by right, and a loyal servant to her king. But her ultimate loyalties were to an older world, to her Catholic faith, and to her friend, Queen Katherine of Aragon, in the ruthless New England being forged by Henry VIII. Those loyalties were fatal. She was targeted not for what she did, but for who she was, and what she represented. Her son's defiance gave Henry his excuse, but her fate was sealed by her name and her blood. Executed without a trial based on evidence that was almost certainly a lie. She was condemned by a king who couldn't reach his real enemy. Her end wasn't a swift death befitting her station, but a horrifying spectacle of savagery that shocked even her hardened contemporaries. Margaret Pole's execution reveals the terrifying truth of absolute power of a king so consumed by paranoia and vengeance that he would order the butchering of his own elderly cousin. Her story is a chilling reminder that behind the grand tapestry of history lie real human lives, and that the long, dark shadow of the Tudor dynasty was cast by the blood of its victims. If you found this glimpse into Tudor history's darkest chapter compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories of the figures who shaped our world. Let us know in the comments below what other Tudor story deserves a closer look. Thanks for watching.